Alright, look. The Discord server wasn't my idea. Don't blame me for having it when I only have 13 subscribers. Now that that's out of the way, on to the video.
Even atheists acknowledge that the book that's most responsible for creating Western civilization is the Bible. Until very recently, that was considered quite an achievement. After all, it was Western civilization that created societies rooted in individual liberty, rooted in democracy, that affirmed the equality of all people, and which gave the world the notion of universal human rights.
Well, sort of. A big part of why America is so awesome is that the government is secular. For anyone who doesn't know, secular means that there are no connections to religion. It doesn't necessarily mean against religion. For example, laws that tell you how to drive are secular. Two big benefits of a secular government are freedom of religion, meaning that anyone can believe any religion they want to and the government won't arrest you for it, and separation of church and state, meaning the government doesn't support any religion or religions any more than others.
Of course, these unique moral ideals took centuries to be realized, and the ideals were often violated.
Indeed, and the Bible didn't help much. Some people might look at Matthew 7 verse 12 and say, you should treat people how you want to be treated, so you shouldn't have slaves. But other people might look at Exodus 21 verse 21 and say, God says slaves are property, so that means it's okay. The first person might respond with, the Old Testament law was just pointing ahead to Jesus, so it doesn't apply anymore. And the pro-slavery person would respond with Matthew 5 verse 17, where Jesus said that he hasn't come to get rid of the Old Testament law. The point of this is that you can find verses in the Bible that support whatever you want to support, which means that people fit the Bible to their own morality instead of getting it from the Bible.
But only the West formulated these ideals, let alone achieved them, and then spread them around the world. In the last half-century, however, many of the recipients of these gifts, especially the well-educated, no longer regarded Western civilization as morally superior to any other.
Are we really going to call people with degrees in gender studies well-educated?
And as reverence for Western civilization fell, so did reverence for the source of that civilization. The Bible has not only been neglected, but reviled, as a foolish fairy tale at best, and as an immoral work at worst. This view springs not from intellectual rigor, but from intellectual laziness. People throw out all sorts of objections to the Bible as if there were no rational and moral responses to those objections. But the fact is, there are rational and moral responses to all those objections.
Okay, let's take an example. Exodus 21 verses 20 through 21, where it says, quote, anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as the direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, because the slave is their property. When I have shown this verse to people, I get one of four responses. Number one, that isn't talking about slavery, it's talking about indentured servitude. Okay, so you should beat your indentured servants? Number two, it was a different context back in the Old Testament. Okay, in what context is it okay to beat people and treat them like property? Number three, back then, slavery was very common, so God made regulations as a temporary solution until he could eventually ban it. Okay, but if God doesn't like people having slaves, why didn't he ban it? He didn't say, it's okay to murder people, but only if you do it by these rules. He said, don't murder people. Number four, if the Bible says it's okay to beat your slaves, then it's okay. Yes, I have actually gotten this response, and of all people, it was from my mother.
I give many of them in my book, The Rational Bible, but let me offer two here. In the biblical book of Deuteronomy, it says, if someone has a rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother, his parents can take him to the elders of the city for judgment, and if the son is found guilty, the citizens are to stone him to death. Sounds pretty primitive, doesn't it? In fact, however, it was an enormous moral leap forward. This law ended forever parental ownership of their children, and with it, the right to kill them. The brilliance of this law was that it seemed to preserve the absolute authority of parents, but in fact, ended it. But you will respond, the citizens of the city could still kill the child. Theoretically, that was true, but we have no instance of it ever happening in the history of the Jews, the people who brought the book into the world and lived by its rules.
This is the third response I listed previously. God made the rule to regulate the killing of children because the Jews just couldn't handle an outright ban. A leap forward isn't enough from an all-powerful God. If God didn't want kids being stoned, he should have said, don't stone children. And it doesn't make it any better that there are no records of this ever happening. Are you really telling me there was never a kid that the entire town despised? And the parents took him to the elders, and as soon as they saw the kid, they said, "It took you long enough," and took him out back and stoned him. Not having any records of this happening doesn't make it okay, even if it never actually happened.
Critics of Western religion also often cite the famous biblical law, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, etc., as another example of an immoral biblical law. But this law, known by its Latin name, lex talionis, the law of retaliation, was another great moral advance. It was not meant to be taken literally, and it never was, for the simple reason that it's impossible to exactly duplicate bodily harm. Only a life for a life was meant literally, and taken literally. There is capital punishment for premeditated murder.
Are you sure about that? Leviticus 24 verses 17 through 22, quote, "Anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death. Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. Anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. Whoever kills an animal must make restitution, but whoever kills a human being is to be put to death. You are to have the same law for a foreigner and the native born. I am the Lord your God." It sure sounds to me like it means to inflict the same injuries. Back to Exodus 21 verses 22 to 25, this rule even applies to unborn babies.
So then, what did it mean? For one thing, lex talionis is the ultimate statement of human equality. Every person's eye is as precious as anyone else's. The eye of a prince is worth no more than the eye of a peasant. This was completely new in history. The Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, for example, legislated that the eye of a noble was of much greater value than the eye of a commoner.
Well, yes, although it doesn't exactly apply to slaves. Exodus 21 verses 26 and 27 say that if a master destroys an eye or tooth of a slave, the master doesn't get the same injuries, they just have to let the slave go free.
Second, the principle of an eye for an eye ensured only the guilty party was punished for his crime. In other law codes and in common practice, if you killed someone's daughter, your daughter would be killed. That was expressly prohibited in the Bible and by the eye for an eye code. Now the killer would be punished, not the killer's daughter. Third, lex talionis prohibited unjust revenge. In the ancient world, if a man gouged out another man's eye, the victim, if he could, would gouge out both the attacker's eyes, or kill him, or hurt his children, and so on. In contrast, eye for an eye ensured the victim receive appropriate compensation for the damages he suffered, but the punishment had to fit the crime.
Yeah, those are both good things. No problems with that.
The next time you read or hear someone argue that the Bible is irrational or immoral, tell them how the stone the rebellious son law ended parental killing of children, and how the eye for an eye law struck a unique blow for human equality and justice. If they're intellectually honest, they'll admit that they have learned something new. I'm Dennis Prager.
Yeah, I did learn something new, and I hope that you did too. Subscribe on YouTube and Minds, follow on Twitter, ask me stuff on Curious Cat, I guess. Last video somebody decided that I needed a Discord, so now I have a Discord. Links to all that and to the original video are in the description. I hope you enjoyed.